Students, we will be covering in this module the background of demographic transition theory and some of the definitions which have come up and as part of the demographic transition theory. The learning objectives are key early works and ideas which were mainly emphasized by Thompson in 1929 and Landry in 1934, the classic demographic transition and a background that has been postulated by Notestein and Davis in 1945 and some of the definitions related to demographic transition. Let's discuss about the brief background of demographic transition. The characteristics of world population earlier were large number of births, short life expectancy, slow population growth, young populations. These are some of the major characteristics. Then subsequently, when Industrial Revolution started, the Industrial Revolution was the process of change from an agrarian handicraft economy to an industry mission manufacturing economy, began in the 18th century in Britain and spread across the world. What are the main features of this Industrial Revolution? Technological, socio-economic and cultural. The technological changes mainly related to use of raw materials such as iron and steel, new energy resources from coal and the steam engine to electricity. New machines were also invented to improve efficiency such as the power loom and the spinning jenny. Work was also organized in new ways as through the increasing division and specialization of labor with the advent of the factory system. Developments in transport and communications such as the steam locomotive, radio, etc. have also contributed for this industrial revolution. Increased use of science in industry is another feature that has come up during that period. Overall, there was extensive use of natural resources towards the mass production of manufactured goods. Subsequently, there were several changes in socio-economic and cultural spheres also that occurred. New agriculture methods that were deployed to feed a larger non-agriculture population as well. Wealth was redistributed, increased trade and production. Political changes were more suited to industrial society. Broader changes in society has taken place such as the growth of cities, of working class movements, of new patterns of authority and of cultural transformations. Workers acquired new skills and their relationship to work also changed as they became incorporated into the factory system, no longer craftsmen. Psychological changes also took place as confidence increased through the use of resources and the mastery over nature. So, these are some of the things that led the demographic changes were noticed in Europe in the 19th century, like in the case of declining family size and sudden increase in population, which was not experienced earlier. To explain these changes, demographers wanted to study the relationship between population and development and estimate world population growth to what extent it has an impact on development. These changes were then generally characterized as part of a process of demographic transition, which many parts of the world would undergo with regard to population growth. The theory of demographic transition became one of the most popular theories in the social sciences, but not without criticism, which are explained in the later modules. Now, let us discuss about early formulations of the theory, especially postulated by Thompson and Landry. Thompson, a general theory on the relationship between population and economic growth with a classification of population, is a main issue that led Thompson to bring out demographic transition in his discussions. His classification of populations is close to what later came to be known as the classic demographic transition theory. He classified countries into three groups according to population growth, birth and death rates. For him, there will be three groups, Group A, Group B, Group C. In Group A, the major characteristics of these countries are low mortality, rapid decline in fertility, population growth, which is the first stationary and then declines, is a major hallmark during that in those countries. Group B, death and birth rates decline. Death rates decline faster and more rapidly than birth rates. First, rapid growth in population until birth rate declines to bring first a stationary and then a declining population. The other form of group C are those countries where neither birth or death rates are under control. For instance, 70 to 75% of world population, but best examples are Japan, India and Russia in these categories. Landry has brought out similar ideas as Thompson also said. The process would spread throughout the world and offered a more complete explanation for declines in mortality and fertility. According to Landry, there are 3 stages of population and development linkages which he postulated in 1934. Similar to Thompson's ideas, but were concerned particularly with the conditions in France, which he took to be different from other countries. According to him, 3 stages resembled Thompson's 3 groups, but were called primitive, intermediate and contemporary. The final stages of the transition, according to these major later scholars, are an equilibrium of low fertility and mortality levels, and as per Landry's discussion, a declining population in Europe despite prosperity, which would be undesirable in its effects. Landry theorized all countries would go through the transition. It had already happened in Europe and other countries overseas. For those countries where the transition would be later, he theorized death rates and birth rates would be faster. He also offered fuller explanations for mortality and fertility decline. Modern mortality decline due to reduction of epidemics, due to vaccinations, better hygiene, improved medical practices, reduced deaths due to famines, violence and civil wars, reductions in infant mortality and improved standards of living. These are some of the major characteristics of mortality decline. And the reflections in fertility also are postulated during this period, especially through cause of children, which is one of the important variables, and the limited parental activity and recreations, capacity to cause parental distress, which led to problems to women from pregnancy to raising them, which all have early motives for Landry gave for birth regulation. These were prior to later reasons given which focused on individualism and self-fulfillment. The classic demographic transition postulated by Notestein in 1945 and subsequently Davis in 1945 has brought out that popularly which are acted as the classic version. So, in this regard, looking at the prospects of world population similar to Landry and Thompson, Notestein outlined a classification of populations. According to him, there are 3 broad types of national populations. Population of European descent that has passed through all 3 stages to a state of low pressure equilibrium of fertility and mortality levels. These countries were in initial stages of population decline. The second is population in an earlier stages of the transition characterized by rapid population growth due to a decline in mortality levels, but with traditionally high fertility patterns having not been fully impacted by modernization. The third category is those countries that had barely entered the transition, characterized by low population growth rates, but given that high mortality, balanced high fertility levels, potential for high population growth once modernization process starts. Therefore, the demographic transition, according to Notestein, described a process whereby the country would move through the different stages in order to industrialize and modernize. To Notestein, the initial stages of industrialization would see strong population growth due to high and uncontrolled fertility levels and declining mortality levels, which led to, due to improved food supplies, better living standards and innovation that came with the industrial revolution in areas of agriculture, transport, manufacturing and medicine. The final stage of the transition for Notestein was not historically inevitable. It was indicated by fertility controlling behavior. Negotiating the transition depicted on the country's particular historical conditions is another important aspect that has been discussed during that period. But industrialization process were seen to impact fertility less than mortality due to various social and cultural institutions, all of which kept fertility levels at high levels. Some of these which are required to note are marriage traditions, education, family organizations, law, customs, moral codes, and religious doctrines. More gradual changes were expected, and in response, effects of strong modernization and industrialization process, that is reflected through increase in life expectancies, cultures of individualism, consumerism, and many such factors. Some economic factors have contributed for declining level of fertility, which have an impact childbearing and child rearing practices. For instance, the issues related to freedoms of city life decreased, social pressure on youth to behave traditionally, increased importance of education and new opportunities for individual advancement, decreased death rates overall, changes in women's roles in society, changes in norms and values associated with modernism, they all have impacted childbearing and child rearing practices. To illustrate, two countries I am just presenting here, one is India and the other country is Japan. He draw a comparison of India with Japan in the earlier 20th century. According to Notestein, India, for instance, there are colonial policies, minimum external infrastructural changes to be a market for British manufactured goods and extracts of raw materials. In the case of Japan, he analyzed that it is a non-European country, a representative democracy exists, indigenous industrialization, initial stages of transition. So, in this, both have led to birth rates in Japan have reduced, but not in India, which Notestein attributed to factors for colonialism as a major contributory factor. According to Notestein, colonialist policies could reduce death rates, but only indirectly. It would not bring about deeper changes in socio-cultural structures that maintained high fertility levels. To bring about a decline in fertility levels, India needed political independence, a market economy, and a democratic society. Complete and balanced process of modernization, industrialization, and urbanization, alongside rising standards of living, universal education, and political participation. If not, the effects repeated transient population growth followed by Malthus-like crises such as famines. Therefore, the necessary preconditions to enter the transition path was liberal democratic institutions. He also did not initially see prospects for rapid results, as high fertility was due to century-long strong traditions which needed to be changed before individual behaviors. A longer-term perspective was needed, taking into view the whole of the modernization process. Later, he changed his view to include more developmental policy aspects to his theory. Notestein and the first 5-year plan, for instance, in India way back in 1951 to 56 situation. Around 1955, after India's independence, F.W. Notestein along with Lena Baumgartner, then New York Health Commission, visited India upon request from the Government of India. India had already included fertility reduction in the national programs through its first 5-year plans, stating with the first 5-year plan having been the first country to do so. Notestein and Baumgartner during their visit recommended an interdisciplinary program that emphasized a public health approach that included contraceptive usage and central government support in demographics. After their visit, sterilization methods were also added to the family planning program. Demographers were influential since then in moving the country towards achieving demographic goals. Kingsley Davis in 1945 has brought out his interpretations on the world demographic transition. In his paper, he discusses how the Industrial Revolution led to an increase in population growth. He argued that population growth in the 18th century Europe was due to declining death rates, as birth rates tended to decline rather than increase across the world. The decline in death rates was slow and gradual, which began due to improved food supplies, partly due to improvement in agriculture techniques and more due to better transportation, which led to commercial agriculture activities and further led to a decline in fertilities. Later, public sanitation and scientific medicine gradually came into vein and protected from diseases and declining death rates has become faster. These changes were a product of larger social changes occurring during this time. The shift from agriculturism to industrialism has been a major hallmark. It included the spread of education, democratic institutions, scientific principles, and humanitarianism. The declining death rates were both the cause and an effect. And while the birth rates also declined, they did not decline as fast as the death rates, which led to high population growth. In the changed circumstances, larger families became a burden, significant decline in infant mortality, but the world high birth rates prevailed, which led to larger families. Families were incentivized to reduce births, which affected the population growth, which began to approach stability. Davis' argument was that the socio-cultural transition of the Industrial Revolution was accompanied by a closely related demographic transition. These are some of the things. Afterwards, C.P. Blacker, 1949, he also brought out different stages in population growth in his paper. Different definitions also we need to understand how these stages of demographic transition were described by various authors. For instance, Lee and David in 2011 have cited that the term demographic transition refers to the secular shift in fertility and mortality from high and sharply fluctuating levels to low and relatively stable ones. The theory of demographic transition is a descriptive interpretation of the transformations that took place in European demographic pattern during the 19th century. It characterizes three stages of fertility and mortality viewed as having been derived from fundamental economic and social changes of development and modernization, according to Turtlebaum, 1975. Kulkarni in 2014 in his paper has described that the transition from a regime of nearly equal high birth and death rates to equally low birth and death rates, generally the death rate begins to decline first, but the birth rate remains high, resulting in population growth. After a lag, the birth rate also begins to fall, but the decline in the death rate continues and population growth continues. Over time, decline in the death rate slows down and nearly stops, and the declining birth rate nearly equals to the low death rate, so that gradually the growth rate approaches zero. The population may stay at the low replacement level, or the birth rate may actually fall below the death rate, leading to slow population growth, that is incipient decline. Developed by demographer and several population scientists, the demographic transition, we can see that starting from Notestein's version as considered to be the classic, demographic changes included a sudden rise in population, never before reduced family size, which needed explanation. The background is the Industrial Revolution in 18th and 19th century in Europe have contributed. The three stages of this demographic transition in the characteristics of these countries have been aptly described. Population growth estimated through both fertility and mortality, and expected that all countries would go through the transition. Negotiating with the historical particular circumstances are very important. In conclusion, I would like to say to you that this is the most sophisticated theory to explain the changes of a society in terms of vital events, especially by considering fertility and mortality levels over a period of time, how the changes occur in response to the changes in the socio-economic and cultural context the society is moving, also have a wider implication. That is why the theory of demographic transition has moved as a very important and scientific one, given the population and development linkages in any society. In the case of demographic transition, when we talk, we need to address different countries, what are the different stages in which they have passed, and also what is its current state. In this regard, let us talk about demographic transition in India. In the case of a country like India, given the heterogeneity of population and also the diversity that exists among different regions, it is very important to know that the levels of fertility and mortality moved in different stages, and also the rate of population growth as a resultant of fertility and mortality levels also moved differently. Now, if we look at the theory of demographic transition, in the first stage, which is a characteristic of high fertility and high mortality, India also has experienced such a situation. However, the different states over a period of time, thanks to the developmental issues, whether it is socio-economic development or cultural development or the other health developmental aspects, it is very important that most of these states have moved significantly in attempting to reduce their fertility and mortality levels. As expected, the reduction in mortality, thanks to importing medical technology and innovations in medical science, have led to bringing mortality levels to be at very low level. And also, the public health measures also significantly contributed for higher life expectancy, which individually and collectively have contributed for reduction in the mortality level. That is why, given the social change, given the industrialization and also subsequent urbanization, most of these states started showing its impact initially on mortality and subsequently on fertility. That is why the second stage of demographic transition was experienced by the countries, by the states which have partial level of improvement in the development spheres. There's, over a period of time, was very clearly seen that state like Kerala has achieved first level of demographic transition by successfully completing all three stages in the transition, whereas some of the states followed, and over a period the other states are also expected to move in this direction. Subsequently, the fertility level started responding thanks to the efforts in industrialization and urbanization, which led to the reduction in fertility, and also the women's status have contributed in bringing down the total fertility rate. These factors further led to the second stage, where the characteristic of slow but steady decline in fertility and reduction in mortality to a great extent were seen. And then subsequently, at the last stage of demographic transition, where low fertility and low mortality are the characteristics, most of these states started showing, initially by Kerala, some of the other southern states, followed by some of the western states have shown. Now that other states are expected to follow over a period of time. So, given this diversity of states in terms of the developmental issues, in terms of the cultural aspects, in terms of the development in health spheres, it is very important that the response to these over a period of time is also considerably vary across states with respect to the demographic phenomena in the case of fertility and mortality. That is why overall we can say that country as a whole, the reduction and crossing different stages of demographic transition is no doubt the country is experiencing, but furthermore, when we analyze with the different states, it is very clear that some states have successfully crossed and completed all stages of demographic transition, whereas some states started showing its movement from first stage to second and subsequent to third, and some of the states showing from first to second. Overall, we can say that still the major issue is how best the fertility level can come down in some of the states where it is still higher, and whereas the mortality level has experienced a little bit stabilized over a period of time. However, in mortality level, infant mortality, maternal mortality, and some of these other indicators which are very, very important for policy makers and program managers to concentrate and focus, so that the mortality level also can come down drastically, so as to see that we are in the path of demographic transition overall.